Welcome to the third in my video series on Sequence Generator Pro. In this video we're going to take a look at sequences. So let's fire up Sequence Generator Pro. In the previous two videos we showed the general arrangement of SGP and how it works, and equally we showed about equipment profiles. So when you power up SGP, it comes in with a profile, either a blank one or the last one that you were using. So that's cheating, so I'm going to delete that for the moment and I'm going to create a new one. There are several ways of creating a new sequence. For instance, you can do new sequence, and what that'll do is it'll generate a blank sequence using the default equipment profile and user profile. You can be more specific. You can also do file, new sequence with profile, in which case you actually choose the profile that you want to use. So that's two ways. There's also another way. You can open a sequence, an old one. Let's just go back a bit. And you can either adapt it by just changing a few things, or you, for instance, can, if this was the right kind of exposure settings for the camera and so forth, you can reassign it to a different target, or you can reassign a different equipment profile. So for instance, you can do File, Apply Profile to Sequence, and you, for instance, could apply this profile to this one. So there's a number of different ways of doing it. Equally, when you are fiddling with a profile, when you're actually running it, so I was running this one last night, when you make a change to the equipment settings, either in, for instance, in say the focus settings, you can change the settings for the autofocus. As soon as you do something like that, so if I just change that by that little bit there, a little star appears here, which means you've changed this sequence, in this case with the equipment settings. And now what I can do is I can now do File, Save Sequence as Profile. And what this will do is it'll take the sequence and override the equipment profile that you previously designed. So in this case, it's this one here. So it's now updated the equipment profile because you've learned during the process of doing acquisition, and next time you generate a sequence using equipment profile, it'll pull in the latest and greatest information. Most of our discussion today is around this sequencer window, and as we previously highlighted, it's in a number of sections. The equipment is in this top corner, the way it saves files is here, the targets are here, and the actual exposure plan is here. So it's a good place to start to have a look at this one that I was working on last night. So this is Caroline's Rose, which is William Herschel's sister, discovered this loose cluster. And if you click this little cog, it brings up the target settings. So you can change the name to something else, you can type in coordinates, and you can set a start and stop time. On this side, you've got the equipment that's pulled in from the equipment profile, but you still have the ability to control things like the camera gain. So in this case, this CMOS camera has a number of defaults that I've already set up. I can do that, or stars, and OK. And so that's the gain and offset that it will use for this exposure sequence. Equally, in terms of the focuser, if I've accidentally changed my COM ports, I can change them back here, and so forth. And if I click that little arrow there, this little box drops down even further with the more obscure data with regard to the observatory and the safety and the environment equipment. So again, I can alter the settings as to what do I classify as safe. So cloudy but not overcast, windy but not very windy, dry, not wet, and I don't care about the lightness because that's not a safety issue. So things like that are useful. Now, if we look at the target information, there are a number of ways of doing it. So for instance, if I generate a new target, I can do that hitting the plus sign. And equally, if I want to reorder the targets, I can use these two buttons and make target 2 the first one. I can also delete target 2 by hitting the X. And I can also look at the sequence settings with this little button here. And for instance, these are settings that are applied to the entire sequence no matter what the target is. So basically I can choose to end the sequence at a particular time no matter what it's doing. I can also choose to disconnect all my equipment at the end of sequence or run a script. And if you do calibration frames at the end of an imaging sequence, you can run your non-light subs, in other words, your darks, your biases and so forth. And the other thing here is you can run a script also before you restart on safe, which is a fairly new feature. So if we want to create a new target, there are a number of ways of doing it. So for instance, if I just create a new target, doesn't matter what it's called, and then close this down, I can open a previous image. So this was the Heart Nebula. So when it opens, it doesn't look like much, so let's stretch it. We can see some vague nebulosity and some stars, and I can right click and hit plate solve. And what it will do is it will work out exactly where it's pointing. And so if I wanted to create a sequence to make some more images centered on this image, I can now use these coordinates that it's already worked out and the angle and scale and say use these results for target 2. So now if I go into the sequencer, look at target 2, it's now populated with the coordinates, and I can change this now to Heart Nebula. And there are a number of options within here. I can decide to not move to the location when the sequence starts. In other words, it assumes that the telescope's already pointing at it. I can just move the telescope to it and just hope it's pointing in the right direction. Or I can do slew and center, which slews and then takes an image, compares the image with what should be there, and then makes a tiny correction using plate solving. The other thing you can do is use the planning tools. So for the Heart Nebula, now that I have my coordinates set in, I can hit the planning tools and it doesn't come up with anything, it's completely blank. And the reason for that is because I haven't told it where I am. So if I just go back for a second, if I look at the user profile, I've said none. Now, if I now change that to my location, it now knows my longitude, latitude and elevation. And if I now go into the planning tools by hitting the little cog, it's now populated my horizon, which is the yellow line, and the orange line is the altitude of the Heart Nebula over time. And you can see this is twilight and this is dawn. And you can set the start and stop times using your mouse or by typing in here. So if I enable them and then say left click where I want to start and right click where I want to finish, it populates the times and the altitudes in here. And I can hit now OK, and this image target will only start at 12 minutes past 5 and it will finish just before 1 o'clock in the morning. Now the clever thing is with times and targets is that you can also make one target come after the other. The normal run of things starts with this one and then works down to this. So for instance, if I now look at the planning tools associated with Caroline's Rose, you can see that this one rises much earlier. So the previous target started quite early. But what I can do is I can say start here, which I think is still in nighttime. Let's just check using this little bottom here. Oh, a little bit too early. So if I just back off a bit, that warning has gone away. And then if I right click around here, which is, let's make it an easy number, about 2100. Okay, now hit OK, and now go into the Heart Nebula and look in the planning tools, or just type them directly into here. So 2100, and then I might want to move this one back off again, because my horizon's okay. So now what will happen is Caroline's rose will start as it gets dark and go on to 11 o'clock at night, and then it'll then slew to the Heart Nebula, which will go from 2100 hours all the way through to 2 o'clock in the morning. And so in any one night you can do several targets, and that's useful to make the most of a clear night. Now if that was going on much longer, let's say down to here, but I wanted to actually end, I knew that the bad weather was coming at around 2 o'clock in the morning, what I would do is move this one and then say end sequence at, and I would put in 0200. So now, no matter what these say, this will end imaging at 2 o'clock, it'll disconnect all the equipment, and because I've already set in my sequence options to park the telescope and to close the roof, when I wake up in the morning everything will be put to bed and everything will be turned off. So that's a couple of ways of doing targets. There's another way of doing a target. So if I add another target and put the coordinates in, if I open the SkyX, it'll probably make some horrible noise in a second. There we go. So I can, for instance, find something. So let's find Bode. So Bode Nebula. So it's found the Bode Nebula and worked out the coordinates. If I right-click these coordinates here and say copy equatorial coordinates, and we use J2000, now switch to Sequence Generator Pro and target 3. If I right-click here and do paste, it pastes in the coordinates for Bode's galaxy. So I can now type in Bode in here. And again, hitting the planning tools, I have a much later rise and transit over here. So again, I could even do 3 targets in one night. So that's a couple of ways of doing things. I'm just going to take a pause and I'll come back in a few seconds. Okay, I'm back. I sometimes just need to wet my whistle. So there's a couple of other things we need to think about is about the sequence data. So I tend to store my images on an external drive, which makes it easier to move about. And I've chosen the file name convention. Now this key shows the key, not surprisingly, but it's a little bit difficult to understand. So what they do is put this little pair of spectacles here, and if you click on that, it gives you an example of what the file name will look like. So you've got the drive name, a directory, the name of the target, and then the name of the file. A couple of other things to look out for. When you do a sequence, you can enable and disable them using the run, and you can choose a filter. So I can choose a UV IR blocking filter, or a light pollution filter, or a narrowband filter. And I can set a bunch of exposure times, so 1 minute, 2 minutes, and whatever. Or I can just type in a number of seconds or minutes. So I could type in 13M for minutes. Now, a couple of other things. If I want to do 20 exposures of each, I can just type in 20 here. And if I double click repeat, it populates all the 20s down there, saves you typing all in. The suffix thing is one of the file naming conventions. So for instance, if you want to, you can put in a specific suffix which helps you remember what you're doing. So for instance, if I'm using a CMOS camera and it's doing gain and offset, I might say G0 offset 50 or something like that. So at least I know what gain setting and offset I used, which is helpful later on if I want to match that up with the calibration files. So if I just look at an existing sequence, there's a couple other things that we can do. So this is Caroline's rose that was running last night, and it was using 2 filters only. It ignores all these, and this little progress bar shows that it completed both sets. So I can increase this, and you'll see that the progress bar shrinks as the total number goes up. And you can alter these when the sequence is running. And you can also alter the order. So for instance, I typically, when an object is at low altitude, I use red first. So for instance, if I had my narrowband filter here and I wanted to run that first whilst the seeing was poor, I could use these buttons to shift it up the screen. So I'm now at the top in pole position. And equally, if I needed to change something, for instance, I needed to reset the guider focus after going from this filter to this filter, which are very different thicknesses, I can, for instance, hit this button, which is the event settings, and I can do a couple of things. I can copy events from other events, which is a handy way of typing it in, or copy to another event. I can reset the progress so that any progress is just completely wiped. I can also edit the process. So for instance, if I've already taken a couple of frames, I can sort of increment up a few frames and then say OK. It only went up to 1 because that number's only up to 1. Now if I do it again, I can go further. There we go. The other thing you can do with events is run a script. So if I click event settings down here, this gives pre and post event options. So you can park and pause the sequence, you can run autofocus on resume, you can do manual focus reminders, or you can run a script. Sometimes you have specific equipment that uses scripts. Some cameras are able to set gain, so you can have a separate gain per event, but not all cameras support this feature. But what I often do is just do pause and then say remember to change guider focus. OK. And when I have an event, it shows that it's a pause event and it shows it's a pre-event with these little markers here, which is handy to remember. And if there was a problem with the sequence, it did something wrong, this little bubble here would come up because there's a sequence problem, and when you click that it will show you what the problem is. So you can do all kinds of things, putting some sensible names in here so that you can remember what you're doing. And you can also change what you do per target. So this set of events, so I probably haven't explained, an event is a sequence of like exposures using the same conditions, and you can have multiple events with different filters or even just different exposure lengths. For instance, on a very bright nebula you might take very short images and very long images, and then you would mix them together later on simply because the dynamic range is so high, and there'll be two separate events. But the nice thing is that each target has its own events. So these events here are not particular to everything, just to this particular target. So each target can be completely customized to what you need. And you can save a target. And also Sequence Generator Pro, I think, auto saves at intervals, and it certainly saves at the end of sequence. And when you leave Sequence Generator Pro and you've altered it, it gives you the option to save it. And the nice thing about it is, say for instance on Caroline's Rose, that's how I left it at the end of one night. When I come back the next day and power up SGP, give it a few seconds, there's Caroline's Rose, and it remembers exactly where I left off. So here it could be as simple as run sequence and off it will go, especially in an observatory situation where you have a telescope that's permanently mounted and nothing's been moved or altered in terms of focus and whatever. So a couple of things there when running a sequence. A couple of other things just to look at. There are a number of settings which are difficult to predict, but you often find out when you first get going what you need to do, and some of those are around focusing. So the focus settings, especially this right hand side, which is what step size and how many steps, we'll have a separate video starting up a sequence, and we'll look at some of the considerations that you get into when you want to set this by. But these are typically the area where you might fiddle with settings a little bit to get it just right. The other thing to be aware of is, in the case of Sequence Generator Pro, it accesses the configurations in PhD2, for instance, which is the guiding program. So here's PhD2, and just like Sequence Generator Pro, it has a number of profiles. So you can import and export profiles, and the ones it knows are stored here. Just to be careful, these ones here are not the same as the import ones. You can have completely separate ones here to the ones that it knows, so not quite the same thing. So for instance, if I'd previously been set to that and then close that down, I want Sequence Generator Pro to use the right equipment profile when it powers it up. So in the control panel for my sequence, I can, for instance, do it this way. So I can hit Auto Guide and then hit Settings. I could also go back to the original equipment profile in the Tools menu as well. So I can do it here as well. I need to click the right item. Oh, let's just, okay, so PhD2 there. Now, let's just get rid of that for a second. So in the settings, when you click settings, it immediately powers up PhD2, and you can see that it's gone and done that. So for instance, it asks you to confirm the path to the program, which is fair enough, and the equipment profile. So for instance, these are the same equipment profiles here that you see in PhD2 here. So just to close that for a second. So I will connect to the right one, in which case it's an RC10 with a reducer and a ZWO guide camera. And then there's a couple of options here: open connect gear to PhD2 when the sequence starts, and disconnect when it's done, which is good. So just something sometimes catches people out. And what else have we got? Just to confirm the slave settings, always double check this before starting the sequence, they're safe. So that will work with my mount and my roof. I can close that down. So that's probably it for the moment for setting up a sequence. You typically start a sequence, you load it up with a set of parameters, and you're never quite sure whether they're working or not. So before you actually hit run, there's a couple of things that we do just to check that we're doing this right. And I'm going to take you through that in the next video. So in part 4, we're going to look at running a sequence and making sure it runs smoothly. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.